Good morning. It's a little bit cold and rainy here today, so we might not mess with any bees. My name's Pete. I'm here to fill in for Cedar while he's away this week. Bees on a cold day can be a little bit tetchy because all the foragers tend to remain at home, and they're the ones that'll guard the hive and fly out. But as well as that, bees like to keep their hive between 34-35 degrees Celsius for their brood to develop properly. And if we take the roof off, it's like taking the roof off your house when you've got the heater going. It can take a lot of energy to get that space warmed back up. So bees actually cluster to keep warm, and they shiver their flight muscles and use that friction heat, if you will, to keep warm. And they cluster around their brood and then move around eating honey stores in the wintertime. Bees have actually got something like 3 million hairs all over their body, even on their eyes. But those hairs aren't to keep warm. They're actually made of chitin, which is the same substance that their exoskeletons are made out of. And that's actually, the hairs are just for catching pollen. So as they're wandering around on the flowers, sticking their tongues down and gathering the nectar, the hairs will actually catch pollen grains. And then the bee will scrape those pollen grains back and store them in little pockets on her hind legs and bring that back to the hive. And that's then packed into cells with a little layer of pollen, then a little layer of saliva and honey, and another little layer of pollen, another layer of saliva and honey. And that ferments over a couple of weeks and becomes a substance called bee bread. And that's then fed to the young larvae. So I also thought we'd just answer some questions. Any questions that you've got, please put them down in the comments below and keep them coming in. And we'll just go through a couple of hive components as well. So we've got an empty hive here today. So when you're getting started with your beehive, you'll just want to put your super, your honey super, away in the shed for a little while. Just store it away. And you're just going to start off with your brood box only. Now, usually when you're starting out, you'll get a package colony or a nucleus colony, sometimes called a nuke. Around here, a nucleus is the most common way to get started, and that usually contains 4 or 5 frames which go in the center of your brood box. And then you put empty frames or frames with blank foundation on the side, and then you'll put your inner cover on top and put your roof on. And then you just wait for the bees to then fill up all those blank combs and draw them out and lay enough eggs to make that colony's population such that it can then sustain putting another box on top and start filling it with honey. You got any questions, Trace?
Yeah, there's some good questions coming in. A few people, of course, concerned about Cedar, so he's okay. Just sending that one out.
Yeah, so Cedar's okay.
It's all good. Pete, couple of things. Someone actually wanted to know, what type of bees are best, do you think, for the Flowhive, and what's your favourite bee?
In terms of bee breeds?
Yeah, yep.
Well, personally, this is just my opinion. I don't generally tend to worry about the breeds of bee. Obviously, they're European honeybees that are used in the Flowhive situation. I think in Australia, generally, we sort of have a bits and pieces kind of variety of bees that are just bred from whatever stock was brought in so many years ago. So I don't generally tend to worry about that. Queen breeders will tend to keep records of things like bee breeds, and if you buy a queen, then the queen breeders should be able to tell you what stock she's from and what traits he's bred that queen for. Any other questions?
Fantastic. Couple of people, how often do you think you should be inspecting your brood box?
Good question. So generally it's recommended to inspect at least twice a year, and more if you see anything kind of strange about your hive when you're just looking from the front, or maybe you smell a weird smell when you come close, or just any anomalies. You'll really want to check that out. But definitely at least twice a year. It's recommended to check before winter time and after winter time. We don't have varroa mite here in Australia yet. If you live on a continent that has the varroa mite, you'll probably want to check more. And that can be just you, or check with an experienced beekeeper. But it's a really great idea to just work that out with experienced beekeepers in your area, how often they check. I usually recommend personally to check every month or every 2 months. That's what I like to do with my own hives. I usually get in there every month or 2 months, depending on what's happening outside. Obviously if it's cold, I don't open a hive, so usually over winter I'll let them slide a little bit. Any other questions?
Yeah, great. Pete, should you change the queen?
There's a couple of reasons why you can requeen your colony. Number one is if they're just really full on and really stingy, really defensive and agitated every time you go and check. I've heard one beekeeper say that if he inspects a hive and they're really nasty, he'll take a little red push pin, little thumbtack, and he'll chuck it in the back of the hive. And if he comes back and they're like that again, he puts another push pin in, and the third time, that's the 3 strikes and they get requeened. So that's maybe a good system for you, because there's a couple of different reasons why the bees can just be annoyed on that day. But yeah, if you find generally that hive is just too hot to handle, then you could replace that queen with a nice gentle stock. Another reason to replace is if you think that the queen's no longer viable. So if you see that the brood is very patchy and that the queen's not laying up to standard, then that might be a time to replace her. However, generally I find that the bees will actually work that out and they'll supersede her. So I tend to work on the bees knowing what's best more so than the beekeeper, give or take. And that's when I would requeen the hive. Commercial beekeepers tend to requeen their hives every year, just as a matter of course, because they think that queens are the most viable in the first year. Some every 2 years, because the same thing, they're more viable in the first 2 years, so they'll just requeen their hives as a matter of course. But as a hobbyist, you can leave, if you've got a good queen, you can just leave her till the end of her life. Any other questions, Trace?
Great. Teresa's wanting to know, do you ever need to add a second super to the Flowhive?
Yes, you can, and in cold weather climates, people do that quite a bit. And that's just to make sure you've got enough bees to last the winter. It's also to really bump up production in the springtime if you've got a shorter flow nectar season. In a cold weather climate, you might want to make sure that you've got a lot of bees in 2 brood boxes and a lot of honey stores to get them through the winter. In this climate, we generally just use 1 brood box. So that again, just check with beekeepers in your area and see what they're doing and see what their take on the second brood box actually is. Any more questions?
Right. Yeah, look, this is a question from Louis in Melbourne. Just wondering though, so it's cold, they're going into winter down in Melbourne. What are your thoughts on leaving some white sugar on top of the inner cover under the roof, just in case they need it?
Yeah, that can be a good idea. I've not had much experience personally with feeding because I don't generally have to feed around here. A lot of people like to use sugar water for their feed. Dry sugar can go mouldy and attract mice. That's what I've heard. So you just might want to be careful with that. Yeah, as far as that, I actually, maybe someone can write the answer down in the comment and their experience of feeding dry sugar.
Great. Do the flow hives, actually I think this was a question last week, but there's a couple coming in. Can you have native beehives and flow hives all in the same area?
Absolutely. I've seen many times different types of bees foraging the same flowers side by side, and it's really wonderful to watch. So you see your European honeybee, and around here we have tiny little black native bees, Tetragonula carbonaria I think they're, but there's a lot of different species, but those little black ones are the ones that the native bees that people actually keep in their yards. But there's all kinds of solitary native bees, and they all just work together. In times of low forage, maybe it might be an issue, but I don't think so.
Yep, great. And queen excluders, what are your thoughts on using the queen excluder?
Yeah, so it's another climate related thing that you really want to check with beekeepers in your area. It's sort of similar to the double brood box setup. What can happen with cold weather climates is, as I was saying before, in really cold weather the bees will cluster to keep warm, and you want to leave enough honey stores in your honey super up here so that the bees can move their cluster around. And if you have a queen excluder in the middle of that in winter time, the queen will get left behind down in the brood chamber and won't be in the cluster. She won't be able to come up with the cluster of bees and eat the honey that's in the top box. So in a really cold climate, if you are using a queen excluder, it's a really great idea to take it off before winter time. In my experience, if you don't use a queen excluder with a flow frame, the queen generally won't come upstairs to the top box and lay, but sometimes, very rarely, she will. And so if you don't use your queen excluder on your brood box, the queen may come up and lay some drone eggs in your flow frame, and you probably don't want that. So it probably is best to use a queen excluder with the flow setup, but as I said, if you're in a cold climate, check with your local beekeepers, and you may want to pull your any empty honey supers off and your queen excluder off before winter time.
Great. Pete, few people wanting to know, do you think you need to really suit up to do your brood inspection, or can you just use gloves and a bee veil?
Yes, good question. That really depends on the temperament of your bees. So as I was talking about before, you've got a really hot colony and they sting you when you open them, or they sting you when you're just hanging around the outside. You really want to suit up and glove up. But it also really depends on your own comfort level working the bees. You can just wear a veil. A lot of beekeepers will wear a jacket and long pants and no gloves. I personally find wearing gloves you don't get that tactile feel that you really need when you're trying to be gentle on like lifting frames and kind of moving bees around. So I don't usually like to wear gloves, but as I said before, it's definitely all about your own comfort level, and if you don't feel comfortable with no suit, then you should suit up.
Yep, great. Pete, Greg's asking, he's been putting some oil in his bottom tray for the hive beetle, and he's just a bit concerned there's been a little bit of mould in there. Do you think that could be a problem? I
don't usually think that mould in the tray is a problem. You just want to clean your tray out every couple of weeks. In my experience, if you leave your tray dry, pollen grains can drop through, and because there's no bees kind of moving the pollen around or fermenting it or whatever in the tray, it just can go mouldy in wetter weather. So as long as you keep cleaning it out, I don't think it's an issue.
Yep. Is there a time when you shouldn't harvest the honey at all?
Yes. Now is kind of the time in question. It's winter time here in Australia, and it's getting cold. And the bees need all the honey stores that they've put away in the springtime to get through the cold times. So you really want to leave as much honey as you can as you're going into winter for the bees. As I said before, they cluster and they move around and they eat their honey stores. So what you'll find sometimes, if you're looking after winter time, is like a big half moon shape that's been eaten out. It's like an empty half moon. If we take a flow frame, you can draw that half moon on there like that. There might be some honey left in the corners perhaps, but that's because the cluster moves around like this and eats their honey. Even in the springtime, generally, personally, I like to, if I'm harvesting, I like to take, if I've got a full super, I like to take 2 frames, maybe 3 if they're full, and then just wait and see what the bees do. If the bees fill those empty frames straight back up, then you know that you're generally safe to take a little bit more, like another 1 or 2 frames, and then do the same thing. But yeah, in wintertime, probably just leave them alone as much as possible.
Yeah. Pete, David wants to know, in hot weather, do you need to take the tray out for ventilation?
Not generally. You can just leave the tray in all year round, and this little cover here is reversible. So you can see these are vent holes up here, and if you've got this up this way, you can have airflow coming through like that, and that creates the ventilation that the bees need. In wintertime, you may want to just reverse that. And those vents now point underneath the tray. That ridge of the tray actually blocks those vents, and they just go down below the hive. So that's actually now blocked and won't get any ventilation. But these vents are, if you flip it around that way in summertime, they're more than adequate to ventilate your hive. Trace?
Great. When's the best time to harvest the honey?
Usually in springtime, when there's a lot of nectar around in the flowers, and there's a lot of forage for the bees, and the bees are actually really filling these flow frames up. Just want to keep checking your hive out the front. You want to see if the bees have got pollen on their legs, bringing lots of pollen in. You want to check the back of your hive. This is the super. You want to check in this back window. And these flow frames will create a window where you can generally see the honey coming in. You also want to check these side windows, and you'll see the bees putting honey into that, and if your frame's all capped, then you know you can probably harvest. And springtime is usually the best time to do it. Having said that, it's a great idea to actually, in springtime, open up your inner cover, pull your inner cover off, and sometimes you won't see any honey in this little section because the bees haven't quite made it out to the end. But if you actually open up the hive and generally pull the middle flow frame out, you might see that it's all capped, and yet you might not see any in the window. And if the others are like that, then you know you can probably harvest. Bees, as a general rule, sort of work from the middle of the hive to the outside. So they'll generally start filling these middle frames with honey first. So if you don't see any honey in your side windows, you may find that the middle ones will have honey. But like I said, just make sure that you leave enough honey for the bees. Trace?
Don't be greedy.
Don't be greedy.
Following on from that, Pete, so you've harvested your honey, your honey's all flowing out, you've closed it off. How do the bees know, like, do they clean it back up? Or how do they know that there's no honey in there to then fill it back up again?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you cracked your frame, there's usually capping, wax capping across all of these frames. Now when the cells are capped, it's like the bees put a lid on a jar, and that honey is good to be stored forever. When we crack these frames open, it creates this channel, which the honey then runs down into the trough and out into your jar. And generally, the capping remains fairly intact. A lot of the caps will just stay sealed while the honey runs down. Some of the caps will be broken, but somehow the bees know that there's no honey underneath their cap, so they're just still walking around as usual, but somehow they know that there's no honey underneath anymore. It might be that the vibration under their feet is different, I don't know, but they'll actually start chewing the caps off, and once you've reset your frame and you've finished harvesting, they'll start chewing those caps off and preparing those cells back and start filling them again.
Pete, do you ever take honey out of the brood box?
Yeah, you can. Like I said before, you just want to make sure that you are leaving enough honey for the bees. So it's generally better not to, I'd say, but if you want to eat some honeycomb, you can, if you've got enough honey stored up here still for the bees, you can pull a frame out of the brood box. Generally they store the honey on the sides because it makes good thermal mass, it's good insulation, and they keep their nest in the middle of the box in a kind of half moon shape. So you can pull a side frame of honey out and harvest it and just eat the honeycomb or squeeze it. Generally it's a lot easier just to harvest out of your flow super. But if you want honeycomb, yeah, you can definitely do that. Just make sure that, as I said, there's enough honey left for the bees. It does slow them down too, because when you put a blank frame back into the brood box to replace the one you took, the bees then have to either draw out new wax on their foundation or draw out their naturally drawn comb from your blank frame. So that can slow down their honey production quite a bit.
And does the Flowhive work in like really cold climates?
I believe it does. I'm not actually sure, I don't have any experience with that, but if you're a cold climate beekeeper, maybe you can put that down into the comment section and give. I just keep bees in my area around here, and it's a very temperate climate, so generally we sort of get a honey flow all year round. Yeah, so maybe you can help answer that.
There's a few people saying, so how do you go about, they've bought their Flowhive and they're trying to get bees, how do you go about buying bees?
Yeah, good question. So I said in the start that generally around here a nucleus colony is the most common way to get bees. I know in the States you can get something called a package, which I believe is just a beekeeper shakes a whole bunch of bees into a cage and then puts a queen in, and that's what you get. You don't get any frames or drawn wax or brood. It's just the bees and a queen. Generally around here a nucleus colony is what we start off with, and that's from a beekeeper who's split their hive in the springtime to mitigate the swarming tendencies of the bees. They actually simulate a swarm by making a new colony into a small box. What they do is they take 4 or 5, 6 frames depending on the size of their nucleus box, and they put them in there, and those bees, they put them in another position. Those bees then make their own queen, and then they're up and running, and that's what you'll buy as a new beekeeper. So if you get your nucleus, then you'll install it into your brood box, and you'll put your 4 or 5 frames in the middle and your empty frames taking up the space on the sides, and then you just want to wait until your small colony becomes a larger colony and fills up your box. Then you can put your queen excluder and super on and wait till they start filling your honey super. So that's one way to get a new colony. The other way that you can do is catch a swarm. It's really fun in springtime, but you kind of have to be lucky to find a swarm. And what you can do there, swarms generally if you're hanging around a bee yard, they'll generally fly out and hang in a tree 20 metres away-ish, something like that, and they'll send out scouts to look for a new home. And that can take anywhere from an hour to a couple of days. And sometimes they can actually get stuck in that tree and not find a place and just start drawing comb, and they'll actually live there in the open air. But what you want to do is catch them in that state where they're looking for a new home, and you can actually shake them. If they're on a branch, perhaps you can shake them into your box, and hopefully you'll catch the queen with them. You might have to shake them a couple of times just to make sure you get them all. And then you put your empty frames in very gently around them and just leave them until, I like to leave them until night time, and they'll all orient to your box. And then when they're all in there at night, you can block up the entrance. I like to use steel wool to block up my entrance, or sometimes I've used a sock. If I've got no steel wool, I just use my sock and jam it in there. It's just a good trick, and take it away at night. Any other questions, Trace?
Pete, maybe we could start selling socks on our...
Yeah. The entrance blocker.
Pete's socks.
The entrance socker.
Which brings us to the next question. A few people are asking, so say you want to move your hive, and whether it be just sort of from one corner of your backyard to the other, or you're moving house. So when and how would you go about doing both of those moves?
Yeah, good question. So bees orient to the position of their hive, and if you move your hive like 1.5 meters away, when the bees fly out in the morning, they're just kind of on autopilot once they've oriented the first time, and they'll just come back to that spot. But if you've moved it a little ways, they'll generally work it out. They'll say, oh, where's my house? Oh, it's over there. And they'll sort of work it out over an hour or two. But if you move your hive more than 1.5, 2 meters away, then all they'll do is they'll cluster at the old spot, and they won't know what to do, and they'll eventually die because they don't have a colony to go to. So to prevent that, one method to do to move a hive a short distance away is to, at night, as I said, jam up the entrance with something that breathes like steel wool, and or a sock, and take it away more than 8 kilometres away, greater than their forage radius, and then leave it there for a week or so to get the bees oriented to that new spot, get them comfy in that new spot, and then just do the same thing, bring it back to your place but in the new position over the other side of your yard. A far more kind of easier way to do it is block them up at night, move them at night to your new location, but then disguise their entrance in such a way that when the bees come out, they think, oh, what's going on? Something's different, and they'll actually reorient to that new spot. So usually a good thing to do is just put branches with heaps of leaves across the entrance here. So once you've moved the hive, before you unblock the entrance, just chuck a whole bunch of leaves and branches and stuff and just fix them on somehow with tape or whatever you have, and disguise that entrance so that the bees will actually reorient. To move your hive long distances, it's just the same thing. Just at night, lock them in. If sometimes at night they can be crawling out on the outside, just smoke them with your smoker, and smoke them kind of in the direction that you want them to go, and they'll just wait for a minute or two, and they'll generally kind of go in, and then you can block the entrance. And then, put them onto your ute or pickup or in the back of your car. If you're moving your bees in the car, a good thing to do is just get a mosquito net from your bedroom, and put that over your box. That way, if any bees leak out, they'll be in the net. I like to move, when I'm moving bees, you can have your super as well on top here, but just to demonstrate, I just use tie-down straps to wrap this whole thing, just to make sure that nothing comes apart. And I generally transport the roof by itself. I just wrap the inner cover, and you want to make sure the plug's in the night before, because you don't want any bees getting out in the morning when you're moving them, or you can move them at night, of course. And when you've moved them a long distance, you don't have to disguise the entrance. You just put them down and let them out, pull that steel wall out. Yeah.
Thanks, Pete. Michael's wondering, with the flow frames, could you run like say 3 or 4 flow frames in the super and then put some like standard frames, brood frames, so you can get the honeycomb that way?
Yeah, great question, definitely. And Flow have a product called a hybrid super, which does exactly that. So I believe it's 3 flow frames in the middle and then 2 normal brood frames on either side, which the bees then fill with honey and honeycomb. And that's a really great way to get honeycomb from your hives, and also flow honey. Another cool way is to, when you've got your super on up here, you take this plug out of the inner cover, and in your roof up here there's a big cavity, and the bees will generally, if they're really full, they'll generally make a bunch of honeycomb up here, which you can just scrape off and eat, and that's really yummy. If you don't want that, sometimes that can be a real pain to clean up. If you don't want that, just make sure your plug's in. Any more questions, Trace?
Oh, it's funny, Pete, you realise how around the world we are, because a few people have like, what do you mean you've got a net in your bedroom?
Oh yeah, right. For mosquitoes, yeah.
Mosquito net. Pete, do you ever have to, like, when you're wintering your hive, do you need to clean the flow frames?
Yeah, good question. So when you've taken your empty flow frames off, yeah, you can definitely clean them for storage. One way to do it is, once you've harvested the honey, because there's no flow outside, if you leave those flow frames there for a day or 2, the bees will generally just come and clean the rest of the honey up out of them, and they'll take all the wax capping off. They won't fill them again because there's no flow, but generally don't recommend harvesting straight before winter. If you take your super off, then you can clean, I think you can clean the frames with hot water. Is that right, Trace? You can clean the frames with hot water?
Yeah, not
boiling water, just hot water, and that'll dissolve the honey, and the honey will come out. Then you want to make sure they're definitely dry, so you want to dry them for a good while, make sure they're all dry, and then you can store them in an airtight container, some kind of plastic tub or something like that, and that should be right. And you want to make sure there's no pests on them, of course, so any wax moth or small hive beetle, anything like that, you want to make sure there's none of those as you're storing them, because they can make a mess.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe one more question, Trace?
Okay, great. Look, so you've got your nuke, you've put it in your brood box. How long should you leave it before you do your first inspection? Yeah,
good question. I generally leave it a couple of weeks. If you're a new beekeeper, personally I always recommend new beekeepers just to get in every couple of weeks to see what's going on inside and to familiarise themselves with their hive, and if they see anything they don't know what it is, it's a really good opportunity to then learn about what's happening and ask an experienced beekeeper. So once you've got your nuke in, you generally want to leave it for at least 2 to 3 weeks just to get them situated and get them kind of used to what's happening, and let them settle in, and then you can start inspecting them. And then, you know, if you want to get in every couple of weeks, in my opinion, that's totally fine. And I actually recommend doing that until the bees have then built out to like 80 or 90% and filled the box, and then you can start looking at putting your honey super on. So thanks heaps for watching.